Story number 1. The Vanishing of Eliza Carter. On the night of October 21, 2017, Eliza Carter, a 26-year-old barista in Seattle, finished her late shift at Midnight Cafe and started her usual walk home. It was a foggy evening, the kind where the city's neon lights blurred into a dreamy haze. Eliza's last known sighting was on a traffic camera at 11:57 p.m., turning onto a dimly lit side street, her usual shortcut home. At 12:07 a.m., a pedestrian in a nearby apartment caught a strange sight through their window. A figure, possibly Eliza, standing perfectly still in the fog, facing a dark alleyway. Then, she stepped forward and vanished. No scream, no struggle, just gone. When Eliza didn't show up for work the next day, her best friend and roommate, Chloe Ramirez, started to worry. She called Eliza's phone, no answer. Texts went unread. By noon, Chloe walked to the police station to file a missing person report. Later that afternoon, police entered Eliza's apartment. Nothing seemed out of place except for one thing. Her phone lay on her bed, screen still on, displaying a half-typed message. "He knows. I have to." The message ended there. Who was he? And what was Eliza about to say before she disappeared? The investigation quickly turned bizarre. No forced entry or struggle at her apartment. Her phone and wallet were left behind. No recent purchases or financial activity. Her last phone call was to an unknown number, which had been disconnected years ago. And then came the strangest detail. 3 days after she vanished, someone used her key to enter her apartment. But nothing was stolen. Nothing was moved, except for one item. A vintage pocket watch now sat on her nightstand. It wasn't hers. The watch had stopped ticking at exactly 12:07 a.m. Eliza had a twin sister, Emily, who had died at birth. Or at least, that's what she'd always been told. But records showed something unsettling. Emily had actually lived for 5 days before she mysteriously disappeared from the hospital. Her parents never spoke of it. A deep dive into Eliza's genealogy uncovered a disturbing pattern. Every 27 years, a female twin in her family tree had disappeared, always without a trace. Eliza was set to turn 27 in 4 months. Was she just another name in a long line of vanished twins? A week after Eliza vanished, detectives found security footage from her apartment complex. At 3:13 a.m., someone entered her apartment using her key. But when the figure turned toward the camera, every officer in the room froze. It was Eliza, or at least someone identical to her. She walked through the apartment like she had lived there forever. Same mannerisms, same routine. She even fed the cat. But Chloe, who had been living there alone for a week, swore Eliza had never returned. DNA analysis from a strand of hair on Eliza's pillow confirmed the unthinkable. Eliza had an identical twin. But if Emily had been taken as a baby, who was living Eliza's life now? Detectives traced the pocket watch to an antique collector in Boston. The watch had belonged to a man named Jonathan Whitmore, who had vanished in 1893. Whitmore's case bore eerie similarities to Eliza's. He had been a twin, and on the night of his 27th birthday, he walked into the fog and was never seen again. Inside the watch was an engraving. Time corrects what was never meant to be. Then, something impossible happened. Detectives checked footage from Midnight Cafe, the place where Eliza had worked for 3 years. But in the recordings from the night she disappeared, she wasn't there. Her coworkers swore she had worked that shift. Her name was on the schedule. Her paycheck was issued. But in the video footage, no Eliza. Eliza's birth certificate was pulled from hospital records. But when officers looked at the document, they found something that made their blood run cold. 2 names were listed, Emily Carter, and next to it, in faded ink, a second name had been written, then crossed out. Eliza's name had been erased, as if she was never supposed to exist. Then one last mystery surfaced. A new tenant moved into Eliza's old apartment. A young woman, same age, same height. Her name? Emily Carter. The landlord swore he had never rented to an Emily before. But there she was, living in Eliza's old home, carrying Eliza's old key. Like she had always been there. And when Chloe saw her, she gasped, because Emily looked exactly like Eliza, as if time had simply replaced her. Some people don't just go missing. Some were never supposed to be here in the first place. Story number 2. The man who killed me twice. On the night of April 3rd, 2021, I received a phone call from the police. Mr. Evans, we need you to come down to the station. There's been an incident. I arrived to find 2 detectives waiting for me. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting between me and the laptop screen in front of them. Detective Carter turned the screen toward me and pressed play. I watched in horror. The footage showed me walking down an alley at 11:47 p.m. The same shortcut I took home every night. A hooded man stepped out from the shadows. There was a struggle. He pulled out a knife. I tried to run. He grabbed me, stabbed me in the chest. Once, twice, 7 times. Collapsed. The man stood over my body for a few seconds, then slowly walked away. The timestamp on the video read, April 2nd, 11:49 p.m. I looked up at the detectives, my hands shaking. "That's not possible," I whispered, "because I'm right here." They took me to the coroner's office. I could barely breathe as the medical examiner pulled back the sheet. It was me lying on that table. Same face, same scar on my forehead, same tattoo on my wrist. Even the clothes matched, the hoodie and jeans I had worn last night. There was no doubt about it. I was looking at my own dead body. The detectives questioned me for hours. Where was I last night? At home, watching TV. Did I have a twin? No. Had I ever been in that alley? Yes, but not last night. But there was one problem. I checked my phone for proof. Text messages, call logs, my search history, something to prove I had been alive last night. Everything was gone. No calls, no messages, no browser history. My entire digital footprint from April 2nd had been erased, as if that night had never happened for me, but had for my killer. I tried to go back to my normal life, but how do you live when you've already died? Then, 3 nights later, it happened again. I stepped into my bathroom and flicked on the light, but the second my reflection appeared, I froze, because my reflection wasn't moving. I raised my right hand. It raised its left. Then it smiled. A slow, knowing grin that wasn't mine. I stumbled backward, knocking over a glass. When I looked again, my reflection was normal. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I was sleep-deprived. Or maybe whatever had taken my place wasn't me. 1 week after my supposed death, the news reported another murder. Same alley, same time, same method. And the victim? Detective Carter. The same detective who had shown me the security footage. The same detective who had been investigating my own death. I rushed to the police station, desperate for answers. But when I got there, nobody recognized me. "I need to speak to Detective Carter," I begged at the front desk. The officer frowned. "Who?" "Detective Carter, the man working on the Evans case." "Sir, we have no detective by that name. And there's no Evans case on record." Everything was gone. The footage, the reports, even Carter himself. It was as if neither of us had ever existed. That night, I locked every door and window, but it didn't matter. At 11:47 p.m., my TV flickered on by itself. A video file was playing. It showed me, sitting on my couch, right now. A new figure stepped into frame. He wore a hood, his face hidden in shadow. My breath caught in my throat. "No," I whispered, because the man in the video was me. I watched, paralyzed, as my hooded self walked up behind me, lifted a knife, and the screen went black. A voice whispered from the darkness, "You were never supposed to survive that night." I spun around and saw my own face smiling back at me. You can't escape your own death twice. Story number 3. The House That Whispers. When Jake and Emily Parker bought their dream home in rural Pennsylvania, they thought they'd found paradise. A Victorian mansion, ridiculously underpriced, sitting on 5 acres of secluded land. A house this big for that price? What's the catch? Jake had joked. The realtor hesitated before answering. "It's been on the market for a long time," That should have been our first clue. The second came on the first night. Lying in bed, Emily nudged me awake. "Do you hear that?" First, I thought it was just the wind. But then I realized the sound was inside the walls. Whispers. Faint, unintelligible, but unmistakably human. The next morning, we explored the house, trying to find the source of the whispers. That's when we discovered the door. A heavy, iron-plated door at the end of the hallway, bolted shut. The previous owner had locked it from the outside. A terrible feeling settled in my gut. "Maybe we should leave it alone," Emily said. I agreed, but some part of me couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, the whispers returned. Only this time, they weren't just random noises. They were saying our names. On the third day, we found a hidden compartment behind a loose floorboard in the library. Inside was an old, leather-bound journal. It belonged to Daniel Holloway, the original owner of the house, written in 1892. As we read, our blood turned to ice. I made a mistake. The house isn't empty. It's feeding. The voices grow louder every night. They know I can hear them. I sealed the door, but it won't hold forever. The last entry was the worst. If you are reading this, it's already too late for you. That night, I snapped awake at 3:07 a.m. The whispers were back. Only this time, they weren't inside the walls. They were inside the room. Emily lay beside me, completely still. I turned my head slowly. A shadowy figure stood in the corner. Tall, thin, wrong. Its head tilted unnaturally, like it was studying me. Then, in a voice that sounded exactly like mine, it whispered, "Open the door." The next morning, we made a decision. We had to leave. I ran upstairs to grab our things, but when I reached the hallway, my stomach dropped. The iron door was open, and inside, a staircase leading down. I should have run. I should have burned the house to the ground. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped inside. The air grew thick as I descended. A damp, rotting smell filled my nose. At the bottom of the stairs was a small stone chamber, and in the center, a wooden chair. Leather restraints dangled from its arms. Above it, carved into the wall, were the words, "IT was hungry." Then, something moved behind me. A cold breath touched the back of my neck. I turned and saw nothing, but the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. The whispers became screams. The light flickered, and then I saw them. Figures pressed against the walls like they had been absorbed into the stone. Mouths open in silent agony, eyes wide with eternal terror. One of them looked just like Daniel Holloway. I pounded on the door. "Emily, open it." But when I turned back to the room, the chair was no longer empty. Something was sitting in it, and it was smiling at me. "You should never have opened the door." Story number 4. The passenger who wasn't there. It started with a speeding ticket. A week ago, I was driving home late at night, exhausted after a 12-hour shift. My friend, Mark, was in the passenger seat. We had just left a diner and were joking about how awful the food was when red and blue lights flashed behind us. I pulled over. The cop walked up, took my license, and frowned. "Who are you talking to?" I glanced at Mark, confused. "My friend," I said. The cop's eyes narrowed. "Sir, you're alone." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. I turned to Mark, but the passenger seat was empty. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe Mark had gotten out while I wasn't looking. Maybe I was just tired. But then I checked the diner's security footage. At 11:47 p.m., the cameras showed me walking to my car, alone. At 11:48 p.m., the car pulled away, with no one in the passenger seat. But I remembered talking to Mark. I remembered the jokes, the laughter. I even remembered him complaining about his seatbelt being too tight. I called him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. So I drove to his apartment. The landlord let me in after I explained I was worried about him. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. The fridge was empty, the bed untouched. It was as if Mark hadn't lived there in years. I started asking around. People at work, old college friends. "Mark? Who's that?" No one remembered him. Not our coworkers. Not our old classmates. Not even our mutual friends. I dug through my phone for texts, photos, anything to prove he existed. There was nothing. No calls. No messages. No saved contact. But when I searched my photo gallery, I found something chilling. A picture from last year's New Year's party. I was standing with a group of friends, holding a drink, laughing. And next to me was an empty space where Mark should have been. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 3:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. Don't look for me. My heart pounded. I typed back. Me, Mark? Where are you? 3 dots appeared. Typing. Then they vanished. A minute later, another message came through. Unknown number. I was never supposed to leave the car. The next day, I checked the traffic camera footage from the night I got pulled over. At 11:47 p.m., my car appeared on screen, speeding down the highway. At 11:48 p.m., the footage glitched for exactly 2 seconds, and when it resumed, there was someone sitting in the passenger seat. Not Mark, something else. A dark, blurred figure with hollow eyes, staring directly at the camera, as if it knew I was watching. I don't know what I picked up that night, but it wasn't Mark. Story number 5. The man in my bedroom window. It started last Tuesday. I had just moved into my new apartment, a sleek high-rise downtown. The view was incredible, city lights stretching for miles, my bedroom window overlooking the skyline. That night, I woke up to a strange feeling. You know the sensation when you just know someone is watching you. I turned over, groggy, and looked toward my window, and froze. A man stood outside my window, staring at me. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't move. But here's the thing. I live on the 12th floor. I jolted upright, heart pounding. There was no balcony, no ledge, no way anyone could be standing there. But he was. I grabbed my phone to call the police, and then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. I barely slept that night, convincing myself I had imagined it. A trick of the shadows, a leftover nightmare, until the next night. At exactly 3:12 a.m., I woke up again, and he was back, standing outside my window, watching. By the third night, I was losing my mind. I stayed up with my phone, waiting, watching. At 3:12 a.m., the air in the room grew cold. My breath fogged in the air. The window pane frosted over. And then he appeared. I tried to move, to scream, but I couldn't. Paralyzed, I watched as his hand slowly reached toward the glass and dragged his nails down the window. A horrible, screeching sound filled the room. Then, like before, he vanished. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. My breath caught in my throat, because this time, the scratch marks were still there. I finally told my friend Derek. He laughed it off. Dude, you need sleep. It's probably stress hallucinations. That night, he came over, determined to prove me wrong. I'll stay up. If some window ghost shows up, I'll film it. I was relieved until 3:12 a.m. arrived. I woke up to Derek screaming. He was frozen in place, shaking, eyes wide with terror. I turned to the window and saw the man, but this time his mouth was open, smiling, a horrible, inhuman grin stretching too wide. Then, in an instant, he was gone. Derek refused to speak about what he saw. He left that night and never came back. 2 days later, he was dead. A freak accident, they said. Fell from a building, from the 12th floor. I started digging into my apartment's history, and what I found made my stomach turn. 12 years ago, a man named Daniel Graves lived in this apartment. He was obsessed with the idea that someone was watching him. One night, his neighbors heard him screaming. When they broke in, the apartment was empty. The only sign he had been there was his bedroom window, wide open. They found his body on the street below. He had jumped, or at least that's what they thought. But the security footage showed something terrifying. At 3:12 a.m., Daniel had been pulled toward the window by something unseen. And before he went over the edge, for just a second, the camera caught a pale, hollow-eyed man standing behind him, watching, smiling. Now, every night at 3:12 a.m., he waits outside my window for me to let him in. Story number 6. The town that doesn't exist. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. Just me, my car, and endless miles of highway. But somewhere between Denver and Kansas City, I took a wrong turn. I didn't even realize I was lost until my gas light flickered on. No problem, I thought, just find the next town, fill up, and get back on track. That's when I saw the sign. Welcome to Black Hollow. Population 1,326. A quiet little town, tucked between hills and fog. It looked old. The kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. I pulled into the only gas station. An elderly man sat behind the counter, staring at an ancient TV playing static. "Pump 5, please," I said, handing him my card. He didn't take it. He just looked at me and said, "You shouldn't be here." I laughed nervously. "I just need some gas, man." The old man sighed and slid a paper map across the counter. His hands shook. "Take this. Leave before sundown." I grabbed the map, confused, and walked back to my car. But when I turned around, the gas station was gone. Not closed. Gone. As if it had never been there. Shaken, I drove into town, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was going on. But the streets were too quiet. The people I did see just stood there, watching me, not talking, not moving, just staring. A little girl sat on a porch, clutching a torn stuffed rabbit. Her wide eyes locked onto mine. I forced a smile. "Hey there, kiddo." She didn't blink. Instead, she whispered, "You need to run before the sky turns red." I rushed back to my car. I didn't know what was wrong with this place, but I wanted out. I followed the road exactly the way I came. But after 10 minutes, I was back in the center of town. No matter which street I took, which turn I made, I always ended up back here. The sun began to set. The air grew heavy. Then, just as the last sliver of sunlight disappeared, the sky turned blood red, and the town came alive. A distant howl echoed through the streets. Then another, and another. I ran. Doors slammed open. Shadows spilled from alleyways. Figures crawled out from beneath porches. Things that used to be people now twisted into something else. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths too wide, and they were coming for me. I sprinted to my car, fumbling for the keys. A hand grabbed my wrist. I turned, ready to fight. It was the little girl. "This way," she whispered, and pulled me into the dark. We hid in an abandoned house. The creatures slithered past the windows, sniffing the air. "What are they?" I whispered. The girl clutched her rabbit. "The ones who stayed too long." "What does that mean?" She looked up at me with ancient eyes. "No one leaves Black Hollow. The town keeps you, changes you." A cold chill ran through me. "Then how do I get out?" She hesitated, then placed her small hand over my heart. "You have to forget. Black Hollow only keeps those who remember it." Story number 7. The Forgotten Patient. I was a nurse at St. Augustine's Hospital, a place with a long history and an unsettling reputation. The nurses whispered about strange occurrences. Doors opening on their own, call lights flickering for empty rooms. I ignored the rumors until I met Mr. Albright. It was my first night shift alone. As I made my rounds, I saw the call light flashing for room 733. I checked my chart. No patient was assigned to that room. Still, I walked in expecting a malfunction. And there he was, an elderly man, pale and thin, sitting upright in bed. His hospital gown hung loosely over his frail frame. His eyes, dark, sunken, fixed on me. Finally, he rasped, "I need your help." Confused, I stepped outside and checked my station's patient list again. Room 733 was unoccupied. I returned to my supervisor, a seasoned nurse named Carol. "There's a man in 733, I told her. "He says he needs help." Carol's face went pale. "That's impossible." She pulled up the hospital database. Room 733 had been closed for years. "It's been empty since." She hesitated. "Since the last patient disappeared." I laughed uneasily. Then who did I just see? Carol's hands trembled as she typed. Finally, she pulled up an old archived record. My stomach dropped. Patient name, Frederick Albright. Admitted, October 3rd, 1976. Status, deceased. I ran back to room 733. Empty. The bed was neatly made, untouched. But on the nightstand, where nothing had been before, sat a patient file. I picked it up with shaky hands. The file detailed Albright's case. He had been admitted in 1976 for a rare neurological disease. He complained of seeing shadows in his room and hearing voices whispering his name. His final entry was chilling. The doctor says I'm hallucinating, but I know what I saw. Something comes in at night. I can't move, can't scream. It watches me. I don't think I'll wake up tomorrow. The next day he was gone. No body, no explanation. His case was never solved. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That night, I checked the security cameras. At 2:37 a.m., the feed showed room 733's door slowly creaking open. No one inside, no one going in. Yet, at 2:38 a.m., the call light for 733 turned on. Then, on the grainy footage, I saw something move. Not a person, a shadow, creeping along the floor, stretching unnaturally toward the nurse's station. Toward me. I decided to investigate the hospital's archives, searching for more about Albright's case. Buried in old records, I found another document. It wasn't written by doctors. It was a handwritten note by Albright himself. If you're reading this, it means the hospital never shut the room down. That thing, it's still here. It waits. It needs someone new. Don't stay past 2:37 a.m. Don't fall asleep in room 733. The words chilled me to my core. I checked my watch. 2:35 a.m. A cold breeze swept through the room, though the windows were shut. The door to room 733 creaked open. I ran. But no matter which hallway I turned down, I ended up back in front of room 733. A force pulled me closer. The doorway yawned like a black hole. Inside, the hospital bed was no longer empty. Frederick Albright lay there, staring at me. But his mouth was open too wide. A voice, layered with thousands of whispers, rasped, "You're the new patient now." Room 733 was empty the next morning. But my name was now on the patient list. Story number 8. The reflection that wasn't mine. I had just moved into a new apartment, a quiet space on the 7th floor of a building that was older than I expected. The walls had that faint smell of dust and old wood, but it was clean, perfect for starting fresh. One afternoon, I decided to explore the local antique shop. Among the clutter of vintage furniture and faded paintings, one item caught my eye: a mirror. It wasn't large, but its frame was intricate carved wood with delicate floral patterns. The glass was slightly foggy, like it had been hidden away for decades. I thought it would be a nice touch for the living room. The shopkeeper said it was an antique from the early 1900s. "It has character," he had said with a knowing smile. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I didn't question it. That night, after hanging the mirror, I stared into it. For a moment, I saw my reflection, me, just as I expected. But something was wrong. My face wasn't quite right. The eyes seemed darker, emptier. The expression was too still, like the reflection was waiting for something. I blinked, and it was gone. Shaking it off, I laughed at myself. Just the lighting. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching me. It wasn't just when I passed by it. I could almost feel the eyes of my reflection following me. One evening, while washing dishes, I turned to glance at the mirror. This time, my reflection wasn't mimicking my movements. It moved differently. It smiled. A slow, creeping grin that was too wide, too unnerving. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped closer to the mirror, pressing my palm against the glass. My reflection mirrored the movement, but the smile remained. I pulled my hand away, and the smile faded. Just a trick of the light, I thought. But my heart told me otherwise. The following week, I invited my friend Claire over for dinner. She was a bit of a skeptic, so I didn't mention anything strange about the mirror. But the moment she stepped into the living room, she stopped dead in her tracks. "That's a unique mirror," she said, narrowing her eyes. I turned to look at it, just a mirror after all. But her expression shifted. "What's wrong with it?" I asked. She hesitated, looking at the glass as if it had a life of its own. It's not just reflecting you. Feels wrong. Like it's holding something." I laughed nervously, but Claire wasn't smiling. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just imagining it," she muttered, her voice distant. Later that night, when I was heading to bed, I caught her staring at the mirror from the hallway. "Claire?" I called out, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the glass, and her face was pale. Suddenly, she turned to me, as if snapping out of a trance. "There's something in the mirror, and it's not you," she whispered. I laughed it off, trying to make light of it. But inside, a sick feeling spread in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the mirror across the room, the soft moonlight casting shadows against it. Then something caught my eye. My reflection was moving again. But this time, it wasn't just a smile. It was leaving the glass. I sat up, heart pounding, as my reflection stepped forward, out of the frame, and stood in front of me. I froze, unable to scream, unable to move. It was me, but it wasn't. My face was twisted, its features distorted in a way that I couldn't comprehend. The eyes were wide, unblinking, the grin so wide that it seemed to split the face. And then it spoke, in my voice. "You shouldn't have found me." I bolted out of bed, slamming into the door as I tried to escape. The moment I looked back, the reflection was gone, back inside the mirror. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The next few days were a blur. The reflection didn't just stay in the mirror anymore, it followed me. Every time I walked past a reflective surface, I would see it. It was waiting, lurking. Even in the corner of my eye, I would catch glimpses of it. Its grin, its eyes, that twisted, unnatural movement. I called Claire, but she didn't pick up. The mirror had started to infect her too. I saw her walking down the street, eyes hollow, her expression eerily vacant. "Claire?" I whispered as she passed by, but she didn't even look at me. I realized it was too late. That night, I could no longer escape the mirror. I stood in front of it, staring into my own eyes. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. The reflection smiled, its lips stretching impossibly wide. "Because you invited me in." With a sudden jolt, the mirror cracked down the center, and the glass began to bleed, pouring a dark liquid onto the floor. Couldn't look away, couldn't move. I felt something cold reach out of the glass, wrapping around my wrist, pulling me in. I screamed, but no sound came. My body was frozen, and the reflection stepped out. Now, it wears my face and waits for someone else. Story number 9. The Silent Neighbor. It was a fresh start. I had just moved into a new apartment complex in the city, hoping to escape the ghosts of my past. The apartment was perfect, spacious, quiet, and in a neighborhood I could afford. The walls were freshly painted, and the floors creaked with a nostalgic charm. But it wasn't the apartment I noticed first. It was the neighbor. I didn't think much of it at first. It started on the second night. I was lying in bed, reading a book, when I heard soft footsteps on the floor above me. Gentle, almost rhythmic, like someone pacing back and forth. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the building settling. But it continued. Every night at exactly the same time. The footsteps would start at midnight and go on for hours, stopping only when the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. Curious, I decided to meet my mysterious neighbor. The next evening, I waited until the clock struck midnight. As expected, the footsteps began above me, so I grabbed my keys and went up to the floor above. Apartment 4B. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, a bit harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the door, half expecting it to be locked. But to my surprise, it opened with a soft creak. Inside, the apartment was dark, untouched, like it had been abandoned for years. The furniture was covered in dust, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. But no one was there. I stepped further into the apartment, wondering if I was just being paranoid, when I noticed something strange. Footprints. Not dust, but fresh footprints, as if someone had been pacing in the exact spot I had heard the footsteps every night. Suddenly, I felt a chill down my spine. I ran out of the apartment and locked the door behind me, heart racing. The next few nights, the footsteps continued, but I couldn't shake the image of the empty apartment above me. One evening, after another long night of pacing, I decided to confront my neighbor. I waited for the steps to start. Midnight came, and the soft thud 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 echoed from above. I grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs again. This time, I wasn't going to leave without answers. Apartment 4B was still the same, dark, abandoned. But as I shone the flashlight around, something caught my eye. A mirror on the wall just inside the door. I stepped closer, and my reflection, no, not my reflection, was standing still, staring back at me with hollow eyes. My heart stopped. It was her, the woman I had never seen. Before I could move, the reflection smiled. I ran out of the apartment, my breath ragged. I was losing my mind. The next day, I went down to the building manager, hoping to get some answers. I had to know who lived in 4B. "Oh, you're asking about 4B, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "No one lives there." I stared at her, confused. "But I hear someone up there every night." She shook her head. "No, no one has lived in 4B for years." I didn't understand. I went back to my apartment and pulled up the building's records. Sure enough, the apartment had been vacant for decades. But I still heard her. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I had to find out more. I went to the local archives and dug through old newspapers. After hours of searching, I found a disturbing article from the late 1980s. It was about a woman named Eliza Warner, who had lived in 4B. She was a quiet, solitary woman who was known to walk the halls at night. One evening, her neighbors reported hearing her footsteps, but when they went to check, they found the apartment door locked, and Eliza was never seen again. The article went on to mention that her disappearance was never solved, and her apartment was left untouched. Couldn't sleep. The footsteps began again that night, but this time, they were louder, closer. I grabbed a chair and propped it under the door handle, terrified of what might happen if I didn't lock myself in. I heard her then, Eliza's voice. "I can't leave." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I turned to look at my own reflection in the mirror across the room, and for the briefest moment, I saw her. Her face was twisted, her eyes hollow and searching for something. And in that moment, I realized what I had known all along. Eliza never left. The footsteps stopped. But then, I heard something new. A knock at my door. When I opened it, she was standing there, smiling. Story number 10. The Forgotten Door. It was the first day of my new job at an old, sprawling office building. A place with more history than I could have imagined. The building was massive, spanning several floors, with hallways that twisted and turned in confusing ways. Most of the building was pretty standard: cubicles, offices, break rooms, but there was something strange about the 8th floor. Every time I passed it on my way to the elevator, I felt like something was off. A faint feeling that someone was watching me from the other side. And then, one day, I saw it. At the very end of the hall, just past the last cubicle, there was a door. A plain, unmarked door that didn't match the rest of the office. It was older, the wood dark and worn, with a tarnished brass handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I had worked on the 8th floor for weeks, and I had never noticed this door before. I was curious, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I kept walking past it, though I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was being pulled toward it. It was late one evening when I found myself in the office, alone. The clock had struck midnight, and the building had grown eerily quiet. The hum of computers and the soft clicking of keyboards were gone, leaving only silence. That was when I felt it again, the pull. I was working late on a report, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the door at the end of the hall. I tried to shake it off, but my curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I stood up from my desk and walked toward the door. My heart pounded as I reached for the tarnished handle. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the empty building. Inside was nothing, just a room, dark and empty. But as I stepped inside, I realized something was wrong. The air was thick, unnaturally thick, like I was walking through fog. My breath caught in my throat, and then I saw it, the walls, covered in strange, twisted symbols. They seemed to shift as I stared at them, like they were alive. My eyes burned from the dim, flickering light in the room, but I couldn't look away. I backed out slowly, heart racing, and the door slammed shut behind me. The next morning, I came in early, hoping the whole thing had just been a dream. But there was something else waiting for me, the disappearance of Lydia. Lydia was a colleague of mine, someone who always kept to herself, working late nights like I did. I hadn't seen her for the past few days, and no one seemed to know where she was. It wasn't until I overheard a conversation between two managers that I learned the truth. Lydia had been in the office late the night before she disappeared. She was working on a project and had been seen near the 8th floor hallway. But after that, she was never seen again. No one had heard from her, and the building's security footage showed nothing. I froze. My mind raced back to the door. Had Lydia opened it too? Days passed, and the door continued to haunt me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop feeling like something was waiting for me behind it. Finally, on the third night after Lydia's disappearance, I couldn't take it any longer. I went back. This time, the door seemed to beckon to me, as if it knew I was coming. I felt like I was being watched, and for a moment, I considered leaving. But the curiosity inside me was too strong. I opened the door again. This time, the room wasn't empty. Lydia was standing in the center of the room, her back to me. Her hair was disheveled, and her clothes were torn, but she didn't move. She stood completely still, as though frozen in place. "Lydia," I whispered, but she didn't respond. I took a step forward, and suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to look, but the room, it wasn't the same anymore. The walls were no longer covered in symbols. Instead, they were smeared. The entire room was filled with dark, shifting shapes, like shadows made of liquid. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. Lydia's eyes. Her eyes were open wide, but they were completely blank. No pupils, no color, just an endless void. And that's when I heard it. A voice, low and guttural, echoing from all around me. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I tried to run, but the shadows grabbed me. They felt like cold hands wrapping around my body, pulling me deeper into the room. Lydia turned slowly, her head jerking at an unnatural angle. And then she spoke, her voice no longer her own, but something darker, something ancient. "We are trapped here. And now, so are you." I tried to scream, but no sound came. The shadows closed in around me, and the world around me blurred. In a final, desperate attempt, I reached out to the door, but it was gone. The hallway had vanished. There was no escape. The next morning, I woke up back in my apartment. The sun was rising, casting a golden light through the windows. But something was wrong. I sat up, heart racing, and looked around. The room was exactly the same, but I could feel the weight of something sinister pressing down on me. And then I saw it, the door. It wasn't just a memory anymore. The door was right there, in the corner of my room, covered in those same twisted symbols. And I realized, too late, that I had never really left. The door is always with me now, waiting for me to open it again. Story number 11. The Man in the Reflection. It started with something small, something so insignificant that I almost convinced myself it was nothing. I was brushing my teeth one night, half asleep, barely paying attention. I looked up at the mirror and noticed something was off. My reflection blinked too late, just a fraction of a second. A tiny delay, almost imperceptible. I frowned, wiped my eyes, and blamed it on exhaustion. Maybe I had imagined it. I turned off the light and went to bed, shaking off the unease. But the next morning, it happened again. I leaned in to wash my face, As I straightened up, my reflection lingered, just for a split second before catching up. I laughed nervously, a trick of the eye, nothing more. I told myself that over and over, until the night I saw him smile. And I didn't. It was a stormy night, rain hammering against my windows. I had just finished a long day at work and was preparing for bed when I caught movement in the mirror. First, it was normal. I lifted my hand to wipe my face, and my reflection did the same. But as I turned away, something made me glance back, and that's when I saw it. The reflection was still looking at me. Not just delayed this time, it hadn't moved at all. And then it smiled. A slow, knowing, unnatural smile. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. My real face wasn't smiling. The thing in the mirror was. I grabbed my phone and took a picture of the mirror. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. When I looked at the photo, it was normal. Just me. No smile. No delay. Nothing. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at my own reflection, waiting for it to move again. Eventually, I turned off the light and forced myself to sleep. But I didn't sleep well, because in my dreams I saw him, and this time he wasn't trapped in the mirror. The next few days I avoided mirrors as much as possible. I kept my head down when I brushed my teeth. I turned away from my reflection in windows. I even covered the bathroom mirror with a sheet. But the feeling never left me. I could feel him, watching, waiting. Then the text started. The first one came in the middle of the night. An unknown number. I see you. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. A few minutes later, another message. You look so scared. My hands shook as I typed back. Who is this? No answer. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked my phone, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But there was one more message waiting for me. Check the mirror. Chapter 4. The other side. I didn't want to look. I knew that whatever was in that mirror wasn't just my reflection, but some sick, twisted part of me had to know. Slowly, I peeled the sheet off the bathroom mirror. First, everything looked normal. My own tired face stared back at me, dark circles under my eyes. But then I noticed something. A hairline crack running down the center of the mirror. I reached up, hesitating, and lightly touched the glass. The moment my fingertips met the surface, it moved. My reflection's face twisted, stretching unnaturally, like something was trying to push through. I jumped back, and then he spoke. Let me out. I ran. I didn't return to the bathroom that day. I didn't check the mirror. I even covered every reflective surface in my house. But that night, something changed. I woke up to a sound. A tapping. Slow. Rhythmic. Coming from inside my closet mirror. I sat up in bed, my body rigid with fear. Then the whisper came. It's so much better in here. I couldn't move. My entire body felt frozen. The tapping grew louder. And then, the closet mirror cracked. A long, jagged fracture, splitting down the middle like something was forcing its way through. I ran out of my bedroom, heart hammering, but before I could reach the front door, all the mirrors in my house shattered at once. And for a split second, just before the shards hit the floor, I saw him. Not in the mirror anymore. In my house, standing right behind me. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, everything felt off. My head was spinning. My body felt sluggish, like I was moving through water. I stood up slowly and walked to the bathroom. The mirror was gone, or rather, it was empty. A dark void stretched where my reflection should have been. And then, I saw him, my reflection, standing on the other side of the glass, smiling. But the worst part? When I raised my hand, he didn't, because I wasn't the one in control anymore. Story number 12. The house that whispers. I never wanted to move back home. After my parents died, the old house sat empty for years, collecting dust and silence. The neighbors whispered that it was haunted, that strange things happened inside after dark. I ignored them. I was too logical to believe in ghosts. The house was just a house, but I had nowhere else to go. So, I packed my bags, unlocked the door for the first time in a decade, and stepped inside. First, everything was normal, until I heard it. A whisper, faint like someone murmuring from inside the walls. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The house was supposed to be empty. The whispering started at night. Soft, faint, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I convinced myself it was the old pipes, the wind, my imagination. But then, on the third night, the whispering said my name. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. The room was dark, but the whispering was clearer now. Closer. Come back. My blood ran cold. Whoever or whatever was whispering was inside the walls. I barely slept after that. Every night, the whispering returned, growing louder, more desperate. One night I heard footsteps, not just creaks or settling wood, actual heavy footsteps pacing the hallway outside my bedroom. I forced myself to get up. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a rusted crowbar from the basement, and stepped into the hall. It was empty, but something felt wrong. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. Then I saw it. A shadow. Not on the floor, not on the wall, but standing at the end of the hallway. Still, watching. I flipped on the light, and it was gone. But the whispering continued. Come back. By the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was inside the walls. So I tore them open. I grabbed a hammer and started breaking through the old drywall. Dust filled the air, and my hands shook as I ripped through layers of rotted wood. Then, I found it. A door. A hidden door inside the walls. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. It was ice cold. Slowly, I turned it and pulled. The door creaked open, and behind it, a room. A small, cramped space with a single chair, a dusty mirror, and something carved into the walls. Names, dozens of them, and at the very bottom, scratched deep into the wood. My name. I stumbled back, my breath ragged. I didn't remember this room, but the moment I saw my name on the wall, something clicked. Memories. I wasn't just living in this house. I had been trapped here before. Suddenly, the whispers turned into something else. A laugh, low, mocking, and then the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped, inside the walls, inside the room where they had kept me, and the whispering finally spoke the truth. You never left. Final line, because I was never supposed to. Story number 13, The Disappearing Room. I lived in apartment 405 my whole life, but one day I came home, and it wasn't there. Chapter 1, Apartment 405. I had lived in apartment 405 for years. It wasn't fancy, just a small one-bedroom in an old building, but it was home. I knew every creaky floorboard, every leaky faucet. That's why, when I came home late one night and walked up to the fourth floor, I immediately knew something was wrong. The hallway felt different. The wallpaper looked newer. The light fixtures had changed. And worst of all, apartment 405 was gone. Not locked, not empty, just gone. Chapter 2, The Missing Door. I stood there, my heart pounding. The doors had always been numbered in sequence. 401, 402, 403, 404, and then mine. But now there was number 405. Instead, there was just a smooth, unbroken stretch of wall. No door, no number, like my apartment had never existed. I reached out and pressed my hand against the wall, half expecting it to be some kind of trick. But it was solid. I turned to the old lady who lived in 406, knocking frantically on her door. When she answered, I asked, breathlessly, what happened to 405? She frowned. There's never been a 405. Chapter 3, The Landlord's Lie. I ran downstairs to the landlord's office. Mr. Calloway had managed the building for decades. He had to remember me. I banged on his door until he finally answered, his tired eyes blinking at me. Hey, kid, what's wrong? My apartment, I gasped. Apartment 405. It's gone. He just stared at me. There is no apartment 405. My stomach dropped. What are you talking about? I've lived there for years. You're the one who gave me the lease. But he just shook his head. This building only has 4 floors. Chapter 4. The photos that weren't there. I sprinted outside, trying to catch my breath. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe I had the wrong building. I pulled out my phone, scrolling frantically through my camera roll, looking for proof. Any picture I had taken inside my apartment. But they were gone. Every photo of my apartment had disappeared. The ones of me in my bedroom, my kitchen, even my keys in the lock, erased. Instead, in their place were photos I didn't remember taking. The hallway, but with no door for 405. A blank wall, a blurry figure standing in the shadows. And the last photo, picture of me, asleep, taken from inside my missing apartment. Chapter 5. The man in the window. I didn't know what else to do, so I sat outside on the curb, staring up at the building. And that's when I saw it. A light in a window on the 4th floor. My window, apartment 405, was still there, but someone else was inside. A tall, shadowy figure stood by the window, staring down at me. Then they waved, and suddenly my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Stop looking. Chapter 6. The apartment that never was. I didn't go back inside. Couldn't. Instead, I went to the city records office the next morning, determined to find proof that apartment 405 had existed. I asked the clerk for old blueprints of the building. She gave me a confused look. This building has never had a 405, she said, handing me the documents. I unfolded them with shaking hands. The 4th floor was there, but where 405 should have been, there was only a blank space. No walls, no doors, like it had never been built at all. Final line, but I know the truth. I lived in apartment 405, and someone else is living there now. Story number 14. The vanishing train. The 11:45 train pulled into the station like it did every night. But this time, when it left, the passengers were gone. Chapter 1. The train that never stopped. I worked the night shift at Holloway Station. It's a quiet job, just me, a few security cameras, and the occasional late-night traveler. Every night, at exactly 11:45 p.m., a train arrives from the city. Passengers get off, others get on, and it continues its journey down the line. But one night, something changed. The train pulled in on time. The doors slid open. People stepped inside. And then, the train left completely empty. Chapter 2. The missing passengers. At first, I thought maybe I had missed something. Maybe the passengers got off before I noticed. I rewound the security footage to check. There they were, dozens of people boarding the train. A businessman on his phone, couple holding hands, a woman in a red coat. But when I fast-forwarded to when the train departed, the seats were completely empty. No one had gotten off. No one was left inside. They were just gone. Chapter 3. The train that didn't exist. I called my supervisor. There's something wrong with the 11:45 train, I told him. The passengers disappeared. Silence. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. There is no 11:45 train. I felt my stomach drop. That's not possible, I argued. It comes every night. No, he said firmly. That line shut down 10 years ago. Chapter 4. The passenger who remained. I didn't believe him. I checked the schedule. No record of an 11:45 train. I asked other employees. No one remembered it. But I knew what I had seen. So the next night I waited. 11:45 p.m. The train pulled in. The doors slid open. This time, I stepped forward, ready to call out to the passengers. And then I noticed something. A man was sitting on a bench nearby. He wasn't moving. He wasn't blinking, just staring at the train with hollow eyes. I had never seen him before, and when I turned to look at him directly, he was gone. Chapter 5. The voices on the train. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know where the train was going. The next night, when the 11:45 pulled in, I stepped inside. The doors closed. The station disappeared behind me. For a few moments, everything was normal. Then, the lights flickered. The air grew heavy. And then whispers, soft, all around me. I turned my head, my pulse racing. The train was still empty, but the whispers grew louder. And then, the overhead speakers crackled to life. A distorted voice, barely understandable, whispered, "This is the last stop. Chapter 6. The other side." The train slowed, but when I looked out the window, I didn't see a station. I saw nothing, just an endless, black void stretching beyond the glass. And then, a hand slammed against the window, pale, lifeless hand. More followed, dozens, hundreds, pressing against the glass, their mouths moving in silent screams. I stumbled back, and then, in the reflection of the window, I saw them, the missing passengers, standing behind me, watching, smiling. The lights flickered, and everything went dark. Final line, the 11:45 train still runs. But now I ride it too. Story number 15, the town that doesn't exist. I drove through Ravenwood every day for years, but when I tried to find it on a map, it wasn't there. Chapter 1, the shortcut. I was never supposed to take the old highway. It was out of the way, mostly empty and barely maintained. But it shaved 20 minutes off my commute, so I used it every day. And every day, I passed through a tiny town called Ravenwood. It wasn't much. Just a few streets, an old diner, a gas station, and a handful of houses. I never stopped, but I always saw people. An old man rocking on his porch, kids riding their bikes, a woman at the gas pump staring as I passed. It was just another town, until the day it wasn't. Chapter 2, the town that vanished. One afternoon, I decided to stop for gas in Ravenwood, but as I drove down the highway, something felt off. The trees looked taller, the road felt longer, and then suddenly I was past it. I slammed on the brakes, confused. Ravenwood should have been right there. I turned around and drove back. Nothing. No gas station. No diner. No houses. Just trees and empty road. Like the town had never been there at all. Chapter 3. No record of Ravenwood. I told myself I had missed it somehow, that I had been distracted. But that night, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled up a map. I typed in Ravenwood, Oregon. Nothing. I searched for businesses, the gas station, the diner, anything. No results. I checked satellite images, street view, old maps. Ravenwood didn't exist. But I had seen it. Every day. Hadn't I? Chapter 4. The people who remembered. The next day I asked around. At work. At the grocery store. Even my neighbors. "Hey, do you know a town called Ravenwood?" Blank stares. No, never heard of it. Not one person knew what I was talking about. I checked old road maps at the library. Nothing. Ravenwood wasn't just missing. It had never been there. Chapter 5, the phone call. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone rang. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Silence. Then a whisper. "Why did you stop looking?" I sat up, my skin crawling. "Who is this?" I demanded. A long pause. Then, "Come back." The line went dead. Chapter 6. The return to Ravenwood. I didn't sleep that night. At sunrise, I got in my car and drove. I took the same route, the same highway. And this time, Ravenwood was there. The gas station, the diner, the houses. I pulled over, heart pounding. I had to know. I stepped out of my car, and everyone stopped moving. The man on the porch, the kids on their bikes, the woman at the gas pump, all of them frozen. Their heads turned toward me at the same time. Their mouths opened, and they all whispered in unison. "You were never supposed to leave." Chapter 7. The house with my name on it. I backed toward my car, heart hammering. Then I saw it. A house. One I had never noticed before. And on the mailbox, my last name. It was old, rusted, but clear as day. I stepped closer. The front door was already open, like it had been waiting for me. Chapter 8. The Forgotten Life. Inside, dust covered everything. The air was stale but familiar. On the walls were framed photos of me as a child, me as a teenager, but I didn't recognize any of them. I stepped into the bedroom and saw an old journal on the nightstand. I flipped to the first page. My handwriting. I don't want to forget again. The words sent a shiver down my spine. What had I forgotten? And why did it feel like I had been here before? Chapter 9. The Truth About Ravenwood. I heard footsteps, slow, coming from the hallway. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was me. But not quite. This version of me looked wrong. Older, paler, familiar. They smiled. You finally came home. I stumbled back, heart racing. No, this isn't my home. The figure tilted its head. It was. Before you left us. Before you forgot. The walls of the house shifted. The photos changed. Suddenly, they weren't just pictures of me. They were pictures of me in Ravenwood, standing by the diner, laughing with the old man on the porch. I had lived here, and somehow, I had erased it. Chapter 10, The Final Choice. The house shook. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest. I turned to run, but the front door was gone. I wasn't in the house anymore. I was in the middle of town, and everyone was staring at me. The man on the porch, the kids, the woman at the gas pump. Their eyes were empty, their smiles too wide. Stay, the voices whispered in unison. You belong here. I turned, trying to find an escape, and that's when I saw the welcome sign. Welcome to Ravenwood. Population 1. Final line, and I finally understood. I had never left.